and evening to you all. Welcome to the Hangout, to the Jobs and Knowledge Platform Google Hangout on extending working lives of older workers in emerging markets. My name is Piotr Lewandowski. I'm Polish. I live in Warsaw. I'm president of the board at Institute for Structural Research, and I will moderate this discussion, and I would like to invite to discussion Albert Park, director of the Hong Kong Institute for Emerging Market Studies, Professor Marek Góra of Warsaw School of Economics, and Truman Gregory Packard, lead economist at Human Development Sector Department at the World Bank. Gentlemen, we are digitally meeting here to discuss issues related to possibilities, to challenges and obstacles, and also possibilities and opportunities related to extending working lives of workers in emerging markets. So first of all, I would like you to define these challenges. What are the most important challenges that you see currently? And then we will move to the other options that we have. Albert, perhaps you can start.
Yes, well, there's a lot of countries in Asia that are confronting very rapid population aging. Of course, Japan has the oldest population in the world, where 25% of its population is over 65 already. But many other countries at different stages of development, including Korea and especially China, the country about which I'm most familiar, are also really confronting this issue right now. In China, as we speak, about 13% of the population is over age 60 and is expected to increase to closer to 1/3 by the year 2050. And because of its strict population control policies, it's dealing with this aging problem at a much earlier stage of development than many other countries have done.
Marek, the situation in Europe is quite diverse in that regard, that Western European countries are more advanced in terms of aging, but Eastern European countries are catching up. How do you perceive the main challenges here?
Well, I think that the key issues are actually the same for the entire globe. And the challenge is that we need to adapt our skills very fast. Which means in our lifespan, we have to think not only of what we do today, but also what we will do in, say, 10, 20 years from now on. Which means that if we start adapting our skills too late, then we'll become not yet old workers, but workers that can hardly be employed. So the problem is the challenge. You asked about the main challenge, and this challenge is not only for my country and my region, but I think it's a global challenge. We have to adjust to living in times when restructuring is permanent, which means we have to adapt ex ante very, very quickly, very fast, in order to be employable, stay employable.
Truman, you have experience both working on Europe and also on the Southern Hemisphere countries, which you are currently doing. And we already heard that the demographic change is posing comparable challenges across the world, but the institutions might be very different. Do you think that we should focus more on these demographic challenges or on the institutional challenges, which can be very, very different?
I think that we have to focus on both. The most important thing, no matter where you are, and I think that this becomes more relevant the more into middle income a country moves, are the expectations of the middle class. The definition of middle income is that the size of the middle class among working people has grown to a sufficient degree that you have a population that is no longer poor nor vulnerable to poverty from passing shocks. And these are, the working people who become voters, who vote for one set of policies over another set of policies. One of the things that I've observed is that in region after region, be it Latin America or Central Europe or even in Asia, the expectations of that emerging voting middle class are to retire at the age of anywhere from 55 to 65. And those expectations were formed at a time when people were only living until their late 60s or early 70s. It's a real sort of post-World War II expectation that hasn't been updated. And it's one that is held by many people, voting people, who expect this. And the problem is that the social contract, the expectation has not kept up with changes in demography, changes in economic demands of integrated global economy and what that means for the length of working life and how to keep productive. The expectations of voting people haven't kept up with the realities of our globalized economies and changing demography. That's a main problem. And it's mainly an expectation on the supply side. But I think it also has manifestations on the demand side. The demand side of the labor market, where employers don't expect people to live longer, and they aren't ready to provide the kind of jobs that older people need in order to remain engaged. More flexible hours, part-time jobs, things that allow older people to remain engaged in the labor market. So still there is on both the supply side the expectation that I only work until I'm 60, but then on the demand side, I can really only provide work to people of this character, and a 65-year-old can't fill this because I don't have enough money to pay them what they would need to be paid in order to be employed full time. So too often, and still too many parts of the world, even emerging market countries, even lower middle income countries where labor market institutions aren't very aren't very widespread and relevant. There's this cutoff, it's all or nothing, 1-0 thing that happens around the official retirement age. And that's something that we have to eliminate, and what that takes is redefining important institutions in the labor market.
Mm-hmm. And
I have a comment to
yes.
what Thomas said. Well, I mentioned this ex-ante adaptability of skills. Because the problem is not only the heritage of the past, means thinking of this age of 60 as the retirement age, but the problem is also our skills are outdated, so we are not yet old. And well, I don't see much of problem in adapting workplaces to people in their 60s. The problem is that their skills acquired many decades ago are not marketable anymore. So this is the problem. So that's why people want to retire earlier, not because they are old, not because they cannot perform any job. They want to retire, and also the employers push them out because their skills are good for nothing today. They used to be good, but today they are not demanded.
Right. I think in China, of course, there's no voting middle class. But I think the norms on the supply side are important in urban China. China is very interesting because there's a duality among, you have a large rural population where people don't really retire until they can't physically work, and you have an urban population that looks like Europe, even worse than many countries in Europe, where official retirement ages are as early as 45 to 50 years old for some types of factory workers, and definitely in urban China there's a strong norm that you retire at retirement age, and that you enjoy the pension and other benefits that the state system has traditionally supplied. That said, I think I agree with Marek that the bigger hurdles in China, at least, are on the demand side, because I've been doing survey work of older populations in China, and we find that today's older population in China it has very low human capital. They're in very poor health. About 24% require physical assistance for some kind of limitation. over half of today's elderly experience some sort of body pain. Half of today's elderly over 60 didn't even finish primary school. And that if you do measures of basic cognitive abilities, memory tests, a 65-year-old in China is equivalent, has the same capacity as an 85-year-old in the U.S. And so given that places like China and Korea have grown so fast, maybe also in some Eastern European countries, today's older cohorts are really low skilled, and employers really don't want to hire them. Of course, that will improve as the newer, younger cohorts become old, because they're going to be in much better health and much better educated. But that will take some time. In the meanwhile, I think the employers develop this attitude that older people are just not productive. And the other thing that may mitigate against this problem is that we're experiencing really rapidly increasing labor scarcity in China. With wages are going up, employers are now finding it difficult to find workers for many types of skills. So that also may perhaps make employers a little bit more open-minded. But I still think it's very, very far to go to change that willingness on the part of employers to employ workers.
One of the things that I've observed in Latin America, in Europe, and in East Asia is that both on the supply side and on the demand side, even in economies where full-time dependent employment is not does not describe how most people work. Even in these places, there's this strong expectation on the part of working people and on the part of employers that the end of working life is this very abrupt step that happens at some age. In some places it'll be 55, in other places it'll be 65. In Australia they've just changed it to 70. The point is it's a very 1-0 phenomenon. It's what's the word? Binomial? No. It's 1-0. You're working and then you're not working. And that doesn't describe, and all of the institutions around the labor market are structured in that way. And they were structured in that way because it's sort of kind of left over from a way that people withdrew from the labor market in the 1950s and the 1960s and then the 1970s. But people don't do that anymore. People don't do that anymore. They kind of withdraw slowly, gradually. They may go away from their full-time 40-hour-a-week job and then start operating a taxi cab on the side or doing a part-time thing over here. It's a slow withdrawal. It's a gradual withdrawal. And that's what people are doing. And I perceive that the institutions haven't kept up with what people are actually doing out of necessity and even desire in order to smooth their incomes across the life cycle. Our old life cycle models in economics have this very abrupt drop. And that's our theoretical model. And that theoretical model has shaped how the institutions of retirement age, pensions, unemployment insurance, disability insurance, they're all structured in order to sort of map that same model. But it isn't the way that people are now acting in the labor market today. And my argument is that institutions just haven't kept up. And, because voters are the ones that push politicians to shape institutions, voters' expectations of what they should be doing matter. So a voter who's 35 today needs to expect that they don't stop working and get a pension at age 60 or 65 or even 70. They need to expect that actually they will stop doing their 40-hour-a-week job and they'll maybe do a 35-hour-a-week job or a 28-hour-a-week job or some combination of self-employment and dependent employment. And it will be very fluid and very flexible, and that's the future of work that we are already seeing now, and institutions have to sort of catch up with that reality. But similarly, since these voters, since politicians react to these voters, we need to communicate to people, this is the future of work. So when you hear about some sort of retirement age reform, that's an increase or an indexation to changes in life expectancy, you can't vote against it because, quite frankly, that's shooting yourself in your own foot.
But still, we know that because we work on that, let's say. But I have an impression that in many countries, even the voters age 45, they want to stick to this illusion that somehow we'll be back to the days that our parents experienced, where you can live, when you can work up to 55, 60 or whatever, and then boom, you retire and there is a holiday. At the same time, taking advantage of the fact that we are now living longer and living healthier. So, what do you think? What kind of actions can be taken to spread this rational expectation, I would say, across the voters, across populations, across societies, who, in my opinion, still don't really want to acknowledge the fact that the old days are gone.
Right. Well, in Asia, a lot of sorry, Merrick. In Asia, a lot of countries are looking towards Japan as a model because Japan has the highest labor force participation rate among older people in the world, and they seem to have created a system where the norm is that once you retire, there still is mandatory retirement age in Japan, but employers are expected to help their employees find another job after they retire. In some cases, in their own firm, but in other cases, in other places. Often that new job is at a lower wage that maybe matches the productivity. And one incentive I think that Japanese older people have to continue working is that the pension benefits are less generous, should we say, than in other places. I don't know. I kind of feel like people, all we can do really is spread the information. I mean, as economists, we kind of feel that, you know, if the information, if it's really relevant to people's lives, that they'll start to understand that this is going to be the reality, and it will be signaled by policy changes that are raising retirement ages. They'll be signaled by greater awareness that the current retiring people are maybe having difficulty having adequate savings to cover retirement costs, etc. And then, you know, I think there's no easy way to do it other than to just improve the information, to start changing norms, and have a lot of leadership, I think, that tries to push it forward. Merrick?
Marek?
Yes, I have two comments, or not comments, but suggestions. The first is that the challenge for public policy is education, but understood in the following way. So we all, each of us individually and also all other people, should deliver a very clear message to the public, and I'm doing this on my own wherever I can. The message is, the message to relatively young people: if you believe you will retire before 75, you're naive. And this is not because I decide something, this is not because politicians will decide, this is because the life will decide for us. So prepare yourself. And preparation means think of your skills and adaptability of skills, and think of your else. Means prevention, everything else. That's on one side. On the other side, it's a good idea to have incentives built in into institutions, such as the pension system especially. So when the pension benefit is closely related to your retirement age, then the longer you work, the higher is your eventual benefit. This gives people a chance to make a rational choice. So working longer is not devoting your free time for nothing, but it's just working for higher pension. If this is seen and if the system is transparent, then people may decide on their own. If they can, means they are employable, means their skills and health are good. If they don't have any prejudice against working longer, then they can consider the incentive and keep working longer. This is clear and rational, but for that we need time. But we should start from clear message. Future retirement age will be much higher. Should be flexible. So, Truman, you're absolutely right. But even this flexibility will start later.
Yeah.
And there's no other way. So people may say, well, we oppose. Well, let they oppose, then they will suffer, or may accept this message as just life, and then they will be the winners.
Look, I entirely agree. I entirely agree. Look, in economics, we do assume that people absorb the information available to them that's shaped by the institutions that we put in front of them, and that they make rational decisions. I don't think that that's a bad way of looking at the universe, and despite all the evidence to the contrary, I still have faith in that way of thinking about things. But the reality is that, you know, economists have a very bad track record at convincing lay people of, you know, what is the rational way to act, particularly young people when they're thinking about events far in their future. What we're far better at is influencing policymakers to reshape institutions. We're not magnificent at it, but we're better at that than at influencing the behavior of young people. So one of the things I think that's important is to at least put pressure on the levers that we have a better track record with moving, and try to move the institutions to match the reality. You know, you can't sit here and tell young people and talk to them about how they have to live longer, how they have to work longer, and how they, you know, have to retire later, and how they have to work more flexibly, and blah, 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 and at the same time have a bunch of institutions that don't allow for that. So, you know, we at least, as economists who are working in the industry of policy, we at least have a better track record of influencing policymakers. And the message to policymakers is these institutions really have to keep up with the reality of demography and economics. And if they don't, you're going to start seeing the distortions. And we're seeing them already. I mean, we're here already. The crisis is upon us. You know, there's absolutely no good reason why, you know, the single most powerful reform in this area would have been to index the retirement age, like back in the 1970s. And we should have all been militating for that way back then, and we could have saved ourselves an enormous headache. Skills would still be important. Labor market institution flexibility would have still been important, but that would have at least bought us a little bit more time before the crisis was upon us. I think the crisis is upon us, and I think that the message to policymakers is, look, you can't just keep approaching this issue with the ostrich strategy. The ostrich strategy is to bury your head in the sand and pretend that it's not a problem. We have to at least do that, because those institutions shape how young people act. You know, we can tell young people, you have to live longer. You have to work longer. You have to be more flexible. Blah blah blah. But if the institutional environment that they approach, that they step into, doesn't provide those incentives, it doesn't matter what we tell them. Yeah. So I think that that's an easy place to put pressure first.
Let me ask you about one particular institution here. Truman, you mentioned that would be great idea to index the retirement age a while ago. It didn't happen, so we have to live with the current reality where we, after a tedious political process, country by country, it is increased. But we also were talking about flexibility of this transition out of the labor market, from jobs from work to the retirement. How would you treat the statutory retirement age and flexibility together these days? Would you rather expect the retirement age to be the first possible moment when people can leave the labor market so they can get some pension and reduce the labor supply, or would you rather treat the retirement age as the moment when they can fully retire and introduce institutions which support them to decrease the labor supply earlier?
I would make some decrease of the labor supply the presumed default, in full retirement the absolute exception, with the provision that, some people, if people are absolutely unable to work, then, the structure should be able to recognize that and to grant full retirement. But right now, the opposite holds. So full retirement is the presumption, and some sort of combination of working and non-working is the exception. So I would switch that around. And then, in terms of implementation from the model that we have to the model that we would want, the example of how the United Kingdom introduced parity, or is introducing parity, between retirement age of women and retirement age of men is a good example. Small increments introduced according to people's age, date of birth. Small increments, so every 6 months, the increment for when women can retire with a full state pension rises according to their date of birth. And what that does is it makes it almost imperceptible. So, no longer do you have these very politically contentious jumps in the age of full retirement, quote unquote, that become politically so difficult. You just have this sort of incremental, gradual change. And so you have basically one contentious political reform. The single politically contentious reform is the one that allows you to introduce that graduality and that increase. And maybe it's the one that also allows you to introduce the notion that retirement isn't an extreme step from full work to no work, but rather retirement is now a step at which you can contemplate reducing your hours of supply during the week, something like that. So that's the big politically contentious reform. Once that's in place, then there's more sort of automatic systems in place that kind of track people's changes in, the average changes in life expectancy and people's actual behavior. But what's interesting is that this is how people are acting. What's interesting is that if people are already working past retirement, there's few cases of actual people just stopping work. Even in the most middle income to higher middle income places, there are a few instances, even in Poland, who are the guys who are driving the taxis in Poland? They're the guys who are, like, there's people on pensions, but they're still out there working. In Argentina, in Singapore, the guy who drives the taxi is a guy who is he's working probably probably full time, and he may be receiving some sort of pension. The point is that person didn't choose to stop working. And given their freedom and given their total choice, they won't choose to stop working. They'll keep working. It's just that the institutions in which they're working aren't sort of reflecting that. They're working under the radar. They're working in parallel or underneath the institutions rather than enabled by the institutions. And that's what's causing all the problems.
Well, I agree and disagree. There's plenty of people who retire and stop working in China and in other systems where the pension benefits, are actually relatively generous, and that's definitely the norm. But I agree with you that the U.S. and the U.K. are very good models for at least making the pension system design neutral in not creating work disincentives at retirement age. And the UK is a good example for gradually extending mandatory retirement age. I actually am pretty optimistic that countries in Asia will respond to this imperative. You know, they haven't done so that much yet, but you know, policymakers don't respond until it's an emergency, right? That's the only thing that gets them to weigh the political benefits sufficiently.
Or when voters are voting for it.
Exactly, and so that's happening now. I think there are discussions. You know, Singapore raised its retirement age. Hong Kong, the government has just raised its retirement age. China, there are discussions, and I think the winning argument in a country like China is that we need to raise the retirement age to support economic growth, right? But that will, I think, eventually be a winning argument because China has reached the point in its demographics where the dependency ratio, the share of workers in the population, is now falling, and it's going to create headwinds for growth in the foreseeable future, and will definitely reach a point where policymakers will react. And I should say, you know, against political opposition, there are advocacy groups in China, the Women's Federation, that are opposed to raising retirement age because they feel that, you know, this is a hard-earned benefit and part of the social contract. So, I mean, a lot of the political dynamics that I think Truman mentioned are still kind of there in China, but they're not obviously operating through a democratic system. But I think the reforms will move in a way that tries to at least remove the barriers. I think a lot of the real issues, though, to get older people to be able to work longer in a place like China that has grown so fast is actually the issues that Merrick has discussed about skills and thinking hard about what are the nature of skills of older workers and what can they be doing and how can they maintain those skills or even invest in new skills at relatively older ages. I think if you change the expectation through the policy reforms that working lives are going to probably be longer in expectation, or at least there are opportunities to extend working life because there's no strong disincentives to continue working, then you'll see, I think, older workers. I don't think you're going to change the way young people in their 20s think about the future because they just don't see that far. But if you're talking about people in their 40s who are in a job and are trying to start to plan out what's going to happen, if they're in an environment where they expect to work longer, they're going to help solve the skills problem because they're going to have an incentive to keep reinvesting in their skills, knowing that they're likely to work longer or at least have the opportunity to work longer if they can be productive and find work. And those incentives are really important, I think, because when you're hitting 45 or 50, if you kind of just say, well, I'm just going to wait it out till I retire, then you're kind of dead. You're just not going to be thinking about maintaining your skills or doing things that are going to challenge you in a way that are going to keep you productive for a longer period. And I think as economists, we're still pretty early at really understanding how different types of skills of older people, how they decline at older ages, how they interact with changes in technology and other things that are occurring to create productivity, affect productivity as workers age, and what workers need to do, and what employers can do potentially as high return investments to improve the productivity of older workers. So I think there's that is really, there's a lot of unknown parameters. I think that's an area where maybe research could help provide some guidance or provide some at least ideas for additional policies and additional practices by employers.
Well, let me start from answering Peter's question, because the question was minimum retirement age or statutory retirement age. Well, the two really differ from each other, and I'm strongly for the minimum retirement age in order to avoid too much of discretion in the pension system. Discretion works against transparency. So the more discretion we have in the pension system, the less people trust. They think that future politicians will change everything, which destroys the trust, which leads to a situation in which pensions are just a kind of taxation. I mean, so contributions are kind of taxation. So my answer to the question is obviously minimum, Minimum means that before the minimum age you cannot retire. You can work later, and you are encouraged to work later, which means that the longer you work, the higher is your eventual benefit. The two correspond to each other very well. And for the social needs that may occur before a person reaches the minimum retirement age, we should use other social insurance channels, not just changing, not confusing the pension system with other social policies. That's first. Second is a comment on what Tuman said before on economists' ability to influence human rationality. Of course, I know we cannot do much, not only economists, but in principle, we human beings are only partially rational. To an extent, we are irrational. But this really matters to have the message delivered. And the message should be delivered all the time on the need, not on the need to work longer, on the fact that this will not be able to avoid working longer. Whatever politicians say today, whatever they decide today, in the future, next generation will keep working until later ages. This is out of question. So this is not convincing people to be rational, but this is delivering them the message. As to influencing institutions, well, we can try to influence institutions, but they are the politicians who eventually decide. And of course, we can convince them to change this and that, but we cannot convince them to lose next elections. And the necessary adjustments in pension systems, they go much beyond the effects which help them to win the elections. So actually, if we have good politicians not thinking on next elections, then if we convince them to introduce necessary needs, well, they will do this and eventually will solve the problem. But this is unbelievable. So we have politicians who have to win next elections. So, Tuman, you're over-optimistic in our economists' ability to influence institutions. Unfortunately, institutions are very rigid, and we inherited institutions from the 20th century, and these institutions are partially good for nothing for the current century.
Mark, you're absolutely right. I am very optimistic, but and these institutions are rigid, but look at how these institutions are both new and outdated. I say that they are both new and outdated, and that seems like a contradiction, but they're new because, you know, my great-grandfather worked until he died. My grandfather worked until he died. It was not until my father that the whole notion of not working until you died came of age. This is in the long sweep of history, particularly in Europe, you know, particularly in Europe and particularly in Asia, the notion of this period of time between death and stopping the ability to work, that time period is a substantial portion of your life, that is a relatively new concept. It's only about 100 and 150 years old, max.
Sure.
So it's new, but it's also outdated in that the point of history at which, you know, a substantial portion of the population could enjoy this phenomenon is now quickly fading. So yes, institutions are rigid, yes, they seemingly are difficult to change, and yes, it's all politically very difficult and contentious. However, I'm optimistic because I think that we have seen dramatic change in institutions in other areas of economics and social policy that were seemingly as impossible to move. You know, the fall of the Berlin Wall is one that just comes to me. that you know, it was seemingly immovable in 1988, and then in 1999 it moved. So, you know, not to bring all that drama into the topic of retirement ages and all that sort of thing, but, you know, I think that we sometimes lose sight of the fact, and young people particularly lose sight of the fact that this notion of a long retirement that starts at age 60 is somehow this sacred thing that everyone is entitled to, that's passed on to us from our fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers. Not the case. It's a relatively new phenomenon that now is past its course. On the one hand, I say that they don't get that, but then on the other hand, I see young people today who are, they don't enter the labor market in one job. They enter the labor market sort of doing lots of different things. They have their thing that they do for maybe 6 hours behind a desk, and then they have their thing that they do from home mainly on their computer. They're already exhibiting behaviors in the labor market that are far more Marshallian, far more flexible, far more dynamic and fluid than the institutions actually are telling them to do. So yes, I am optimistic, because I think that our institutions will catch up with people's expectations, and it's when the expectation of the median voter, the middle class voter, changes how that voter votes. That's when we'll see the change in the institutions. Where will that happen first? I don't know.
Well, but the median voter is getting older and older. This is the problem.
But
your
well,
way of thinking
you're right.
is changing.
Yeah, you're right.
And the other thing, Truman, I don't think you should be so hard on retirement. I mean, one could say that the fact that your father could retire is a sign of progress. And what I have in mind is that if you think about rural China, where people basically work until they drop, the inability of very old people in ill health to stop working, I think, creates enormous kind of burden on them, because they don't have any safety net, and the only thing that stops them from working is if they literally physically cannot manage to do it. And so the idea that you can save or have systems that provide some security and some ability to retire sometime before you die, I don't think is a bad thing. I don't think anyone, but of course, when retirement ages were set, they had, were based on a certain life expectancy. And now, with life expectancy going much longer, I think those ages are obviously unrealistic. So you're right about that in terms of the ages being outdated. But the idea of retirement, I don't think, is outdated. I think it's just trying to make retirement work in a way that balances appropriately, the ability of the system to sustain support for people, and especially when people, if they can choose to retire, I think that's still a good thing. It makes their lives better and more rewarding. So I just don't want to go too far in saying that we should go back 3 generations. And
no, you're absolutely right. And I think that maybe the more nuanced way to say it is that retirement can no longer be seen as the period of life when we stop working. It's the period of life in which we start to withdrawal, or we change our relationship to income, to income generating activity. It has to change. It has to change because we become slower, we become less able to commit for longer periods of time, we want to do other things. So the issue is, how do you support a period of life when you need to consume and you're unable to earn as much as you did before from selling your labor? I mean, that's the fundamental issue, and I find it really, really liberating to strip it back to that very simple fundamental issue, because it really kind of clarifies things. It then sort of liberates you to have the kind of institutions that allow you know, the older person who greets you at the Walmart, or you know, here in Sydney, the older people who wear bright yellow jackets and they're working, you know, maybe 2 or 3 hours a day at the airport, and basically their role is to be the friendly face that tells people, you know, who arrive to Australia at the for the very first time how to manage and where to go and blah blah blah. I mean, that's the point, is that, you know, that there will need to be, and there already are, a whole new set of jobs that cater to this demographic of people who won't be working 8 hours a day. They'll be working 2 or 3 or 4 hours a day. They'll be probably not be doing heavily cognitive things. They'll be doing things that are just more sort of personal relations, where, you know, patience and understanding and a gentle nature, and sort of the wise, calm hand, where those are the skills that are more important than, you know, precision and aware and alertness. You know, we don't want them driving big, huge machines. But you know, they'd be absolutely fantastic at helping sort of people find their way in a perplexing situation. So. The point is, do the institutions allow the employers to offer those sorts of jobs? And if they aren't, that's a problem that economists can focus on and help politicians to change.
Well, you're absolutely right. Institutions should support this, but at the same time, we can be a bit more optimistic here. I'm also an optimist. Well, in the future, in the near future, or even now, young labor force is getting more and more scarce, which means that employers, if they need additional workers, they will have to employ people who are a bit older. So this thing will somehow fix itself. So the only labor available will be of 50s, means people in their 50s or 60s.
Yes, but in that situation, that you just described, also if the pool of the young workers is getting scarcer and scarcer, then probably that need to update skills will be even bigger, as we already identified. It is crucial. Do you think that markets will deliver that that markets will deliver the service to these older workers or aging workers to update the skills, or is it the area where the government have to intervene?
Well, the market will, but what matters the most is to adjust skills ex ante. So the skills should be delivered not to people who are getting older, but to young people, together with a message that your qualifications, even if they are the best possible ones, will be sufficient for some 20 years, and afterwards you will have to have new skills, not to update your current skills, but entirely new skills. So if we supply this type of services to people in their 30s, then when they are in their 50s, they will be highly employable.
Right. I think I share Marek's optimism that the fundamentals of the market pressure and the labor scarcity will eventually kind of push employers and employees in the right directions. But of course, you know, how fast that occurs, and there's still an enormous range of how well that adjustment or how smoothly that adjustment occurs, and you know, the welfare of many workers and many firms kind of still hang in the balance, I think, in terms of trying to facilitate that process of learning and facilitation. So, you know, of course, we're right to focus on the institutions, and it'll be pushed along by the market pressures. I mean, I'm amazed in China, the labor market has changed so much in the past 5 years, even, where now you know, employers in the part of southern China near Hong Kong, where we've been doing some firms interviews, you know, they just are really struggling to find workers of all skills, but especially the low-skilled workers. And you know, since our old people are also very low-skilled, actually, in the spectrum of the skill distribution, I think maybe that is promising, where we'll see eventually some efforts to try to incorporate older workers. Although I must say that if you talk to the managers today, they still say we don't want to have anything to do with older workers. And one concern that I have is that if you extend, let's say, mandatory retirement age in China, and it really is true that the older workers really have outdated skills, and basically, given the way wages, the way wage determination works, that as people reaching older ages, maybe their productivity is actually below their wage, then actually by extending retirement age, you're actually imposing costs on the enterprise, because at least in China, they can't really fire the workers that easily, and there's now new protective legislation that the government has passed for workers, which increases the cost of firing people, at any age, really, after they've achieved a certain number of years of work experience with the firm. So I think it still raises a whole bunch of issues, but I think I think it will to an extent work itself out slowly over time.
Well, if there's no other comment, let me say the following. Labor protection is needed, but if we protect the elderly, the employment, then we expose them to a risk of not being employed. So we have to be very careful when offering this type of protection to elder people. So probably there should be kind of balance of protecting them and treating normally as all other workers at the same time.
Mm-hmm. I'm also wondering, because there a lot of discussion that we're having leads to the conclusion that basically the information from the economics should be targeted to policymakers, but at the same time the public support is crucial. Also because we hope that not only policymakers listen to us now, that also some citizens are listening to us now, but also because, as Marek said, the median voter is getting older, so his expectations will be more and more important in shaping the policy. And when I follow the process of reform related to retirement age, to pension systems and things like that, what strikes me is that a lot of focus in terms of message to the audience is a focus on economic growth. We need to do this to have higher economic growth. Or the focus is on public finance. We have to do it to save public finance from the crisis, or to reduce public debt, things like that. Perhaps there should be this shift to focus more in communicating the message on how the length of working lives impacts on personal lives and situations. That is actually that people don't feel that it's a need that they have to work longer to contribute to economic growth, but they have to work longer to increase their standards of living over the life course. Why is that the governments often, and even the economists often, focus on these macro benefits instead of communicating on the micro economic level?
Well, I think economists usually are talking to policymakers, so they're trying to convince them of the macro benefit. But I completely agree with you that the way to, and maybe it's really the way that it should be pitched to everyone, not just the citizens, but that sensible reforms in these areas will actually allow individuals to have more fulfilling lives, including their work lives. It'll give them more choices and more options. So, if they want to work longer and save more and have more available for retirement, they can do that. I don't think you can ever tell people they have to do something, right, for the good of the country or something. That no one will respond to an incentive like that. But I think if you say, look, there are a lot of reasons why you may want to work longer, you surely would want to have that as an option, especially if for people whose work experience is rewarding and meaningful, but also financially, that it puts them in a better position to meet more realistic retirement goals. So I think you need to give people better sense of how they can better their own lives. One, by understanding what's likely to happen in the future, given life expectancy and given the financial requirements of supporting retirement over different durations. Yeah, so sell it as an empowerment kind of an agenda, as opposed to as a do something for the country. That seems more like a more effective strategy to me, anyway.
Yeah, that's sure. I think that people will keep working longer if they find this beneficial for them. Employers will employ more elderly workers if that's beneficial for them. So we need to deliver this message to people, help them to see this. And eventually, more options is not necessarily a good option, no good solution. I would suggest more transparent options. People should easily understand that. Most of the options available now are fuzzy, unclear for people who are non-economists, especially when you take into account that most economic relationships are non-linear, while our brains work in linear way. So we make mistakes, even if we think rationally. So what matters is to have the system and the entire institutional structure transparent and easy to understand for the people. Then they will eventually shift towards a bit more of rationality, I guess.
Right.
Important messages always take a very long time to trickle down and to be absorbed, to be sufficiently absorbed to influence people's behavior. It's amazing how long we've been talking about how low minimum retirement ages were set, and how important it is to keep the minimum retirement age flexible and relevant to changes in life expectancy. It's amazing how long we've been talking about that. It's amazing how long we've been talking about the importance of, transparency in pension systems and all social insurance systems and stuff like that. I agree with Marek. We have to keep talking about these things. We have to keep sending these messages because it does take a long time for them to trickle down and to be absorbed. One of those same well-known, oft-repeated messages is the importance of the business environment, particularly for small, medium, micro enterprise and for self-employed. Most older people, as they withdraw progressively from the labor market, what they want to retire from is not work. They want to retire from having to respond to someone else's issues. They want to retire into more independence. Sometimes that independence takes the form of self-employment. Sometimes it takes the form of taking a job with a smaller firm. If the business environment continues to be so prejudicial against small and medium enterprise, then we are knocking off, we are constraining a whole area of the business environment that will provide the jobs for older people if they are not working for themselves. Many will end up working, or they would want to work for themselves. They would aspire to work for themselves. So the longer that we starve small and medium enterprise of credit, the longer that we make it difficult to set up a business, the longer that we make the playing field so uneven and skewed in the favor of larger enterprises, the more constrained the employment market, not labor market, employment market will be for older people. Because that's probably where most people at older ages would go. So that's one of those well-known messages that is as well-known as keeping your retirement age flexible and movable according to life expectancy. Help microenterprise, help the business environment for self-employment, and that will give more older people ways of remaining active and productive longer into their lives.
Okay.
Let me
Thanks.
extend this message, just a short sentence. We should add also investment in education and flexible skills. This will help us to solve the problem.
Yes, and actually, I will try to wrap it up because we spent an hour discussing these issues, and what strikes me is that it's probably one of these areas of public policy that is one of the most broad, because we can talk about pension systems, but actually we can also talk about any single labor market institution that there is. We can talk about taxation, how we treat the part-time work, and we can talk about minimum wages, about employment protection legislation. So that kind of coherent and broad approach to extending working life is crucial here. What I think is very important, and was probably in the center of the problem, to put it this way, is that this rising middle income class that Schumann mentioned, it's becoming older and older, as Mark mentioned, but at the same time, even though it's not voting anywhere, it's that middle class, it still struggles to change their expectations towards the future, towards their retirement. Over the last decades, we kind of learned that we will retire even earlier than our parents retired, and it's difficult for us to change. Also, because I think that in the public discussion, too much of a focus is placed on the macroeconomic or public finance results from reforms in that regard. Not enough focus and not enough message is being targeted at people who will be affected by these reforms and who can see them as opportunity or as a way of preparing for the phenomena which will affect them anyway, but because they are politically difficult, currently they are often kind of like treated like unsecure future challenges that perhaps can be avoided by sticking to the status quo, which we all know will definitely not happen. So I think that it's also crucial that we should not confuse pension systems with other systems of other social system and other elements of public policy, and we should create clear, transparent pension systems which show workers what's the aim of the pension system, that the pension system just helps them to smooth their income across the life course, and it's not a way to compensate them for any kind of problems that they approach on the labor market or any kind of deficiencies in the public policy in any other regard. And we should start working fast and efficiently on rebuilding all our labor market institutions to support the smooth transitions and to support the flexibility in how people adjust to the change in the economic environment and to the fact that more and more workers will be more and more older, I would say. So that's for me. I hope that this discussion leaves our viewers, listeners, with as many illuminating thoughts and as many inspirations as it leaves me. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for your participation, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss these issues in a real, not in digital way, one day.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you very much.